everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a couple of brand new album reviews for some projects I happened to hear recently. Let's get right into things with the first project. I want to talk about the newest record from Weezer, OK Human. Honestly, I was not looking forward to this record all that much. Not because I dislike Weezer overall as a band, but more so just because the last few years of this band's existence have kind of been all over the place when it comes to the quality of the music. You know, I felt like projects like Everything Will Be Alright in the End and the White Album were a return to form for the group. I thought those were really great projects, but everything that followed was just really messy for the most part. There were some tracks amongst those records that I enjoyed, but yeah, it was just kind of not a super great period for the band in terms of quality. And also, this project's rollout was also super weird too, because the band back in, I believe it was September of 2019, said their newest record was going to be called Van Weezer. It was set to drop in May of 2020. It didn't end up happening because of the pandemic, and now that record is set to drop in May of this year instead. But in addition to that being the case, the group also dropped this new record in January of this year too, and this whole idea just seemed like a bit of a mess to me. And honestly, this isn't the first time the group has done something like this. They've dropped surprise records before, previously announced projects before too. And in the past, I don't think they've worked out all that nicely. And I wasn't expecting OK Human to be all that great either for the same reasons. And honestly, this was a project that I found to be a bit more interesting than I was expecting. This wasn't quite as low effort or filler-like, I guess, as a project like Teal was, in my opinion. But at the same time, I didn't enjoy this record either. You know, I don't think this is the worst album in this band's catalog, but at the same time, I didn't find this to be all that enjoyable of a record. But I could certainly see why for some people this would be an interesting step in a different direction for the group. But I can kind of understand why there's a lot of people out there finding themselves really enjoying this thing while I didn't. The sound of this record is unlike anything Weezer has done before. It's recorded completely analog. They have a whole orchestra backing them up here on this thing. And because of that, the whole soundscape of this record feels a lot more natural, a lot more full, a lot less like rock influenced, I guess. You know, the guitars here on this thing aren't super heavy or prominent or anything like that. The orchestra really takes over and a lot of the instrumentation here to give you this bigger, more natural sounding release, unlike anything the band has done and any of the previous releases. And admittedly, on the first few listens I gave this project, this stood out to me as being a pretty positive point here with this project because, like I said, it's different from anything else the band has done before. It's refreshing in that regard. But the more listens I gave this record, the more, I don't dislike this change in sound necessarily, but it isn't quite as striking or great as I thought it was on my first few listens of this project because, yes, it is different from anything Weezer has done before, but at the same time, there's plenty of other artists out there that have played around with these same sounds, but done it in ways that are a lot more interesting than Weezer are doing it here on this project. You know, the instrumentals here on this thing, all of them sound fine enough, I guess. None of them sound bad necessarily or anything like that. None of them are painful to listen to or grating or anything like that. But at the same time, for the most part, a lot of the instrumentals here on this thing are super forgettable, in my opinion. They lack a lot of that memorability that the best of Weezer's instrumentals in the past had to them. You know, like the general sound of them, yes, is different from previous Weezer material, but in the greater scope of music, it doesn't really have that. And like I also mentioned before, while the orchestra takes a larger role in the soundscape of this record, stuff like the guitars take a bit more of a backseat position here on this thing. And because of that, you don't really have any crunchy, memorable power pop riffs here on this thing that were often present on the best material from this band in the past. And hey, those aren't necessary to have on a project from Weezer to make a good project or anything like that. I'm not saying they're like essential to the band's sound or anything like that, but the lack of those on a project like this mixed with the fact that the new direction that the band is going in is just kind of, forgettable, I guess. It just leads to a lot of the instrumentals here on this thing being kind of uninteresting for the most part. Again, they all sound pleasant enough, but at the same time, there's just very little to them that I think is all that interesting outside of, saying that Weezer's doing a little bit of something different here on this project. Because, yeah, they are doing something different here, but it's not different or special enough in the greater scheme of music that it's really all that worth getting worked up over. There's bands making projects that sound like this back as far as like the 1960s that still sound better and hold up a lot better than a project like this. Why I'd want to listen to this again instead of those, I'm not completely sure. The hooks here on this record also aren't super memorable either. I mean, there are a few melodies packed into this thing that are pretty pleasant to listen to, while you're actually in the act of listening to the record, but nothing about the hooks or the melodies here on this thing are like sticky enough for me to really care about after listening to this project. Which again, for a band like Weezer, where the catchiness is probably one of their biggest strengths when the group is at their best, that's a pretty big disappointment here on this project. One positive thing that I will say about this record and how the songs are laid out on this thing is that the album does flow together rather nicely. I feel like the way the album goes from track to track here on this thing is very smooth, very natural sounding. I do really appreciate that little detail here in the project. It's a shame that it's just not something that can make this project a bit more enjoyable for me. And then you have the lyrics here on this project. The part of this record that I think is probably the least enjoyable overall, mostly because it still feels like here on this thing that Weezer are kind of in the same state that they have been the past few years of their career, kind of like trapped in this weird state of trying to appeal to like a young Zoomer crowd with a lot of their references and a lot of the humor they try to incorporate into their music. But at the same time, they're also an aging band too that's trying to appeal to their older audience. There is some self-reflection here on this thing, trying to see where exactly the group stands at this point in time in the greater landscape of music and things like that. This is also a quarantine album too, trying to incorporate some of that into the lyrics here on this thing. And yeah, the lyrics here on this project just end up being a pretty big mess overall, and generally this thing suffers from being kind of nondescript with its lyrics a lot of the time. Certain tracks on this thing have decent ideas to them for what they want to talk about, but they just don't go into enough detail here on this thing to really end up being interesting. Like there's a track on this thing where Rivers is singing about his life before the pandemic and his like daily schedule and stuff, like very basic stuff that is generally considered mundane, but in the context of the world that we're currently living in, it seems a lot more desirable. And it's kind of interesting idea, admittedly, but the execution just isn't all that interesting. It still ends up coming across as just being kind of mundane. The opening track on this thing also has this kind of interesting idea with comparing things that are like enjoyable with things that are harmful or bad. But this idea, while kind of interesting on the surface, just isn't really explored in enough detail to actually be all that exciting to like digest and take in. Admittedly, the opening track here is still probably one of the stronger cuts on this thing. It's one of the few moments on this thing where I think the hook work is actually kind of memorable, but still, the lyrics here on this track just do not go into enough detail to really be memorable, all things considered. For the most part, the lyrics here on this thing are bad, not like offensively terrible or anything like that, but there are a few moments on this thing where the lyrics just descend into being outright like ridiculously bad. Probably the biggest example here on this project comes in the form of the track Screens, a kind of like anti-technology song of sorts where they're like complaining about people being stuck to their screens on their phones and all of that, and just, oh my goodness, this is so insipid and stupid. It's like the most generic cliches that you could find for a track like this about people being addicted to technology and all of that and trying to compact it into a single song. And it is just so unlikable, especially when you consider the fact that there's so much time on this project where it seems like the band is trying to really like appeal to their younger fan base. This song feels like it kind of like goes directly against like appealing to that certain demographic of people. That's kind of shocking that they still decide to go with a track like this. In addition to that, it also feels very antithetical to the whole quarantine concept of this project too, because in the midst of a pandemic and trying to stay away from people, communicating with each other through screens, over Zoom, FaceTime, whatever application you may use, is like the safest way for people who don't live together to communicate with each other nowadays. And I don't know, like obviously that's not what they're talking about in this song specifically, but it's a very weird track to have on a project like this, which is also meant to, in some other ways, be like a quarantine project that on other songs here reflects on that newer lifestyle that we've all kind of been forced to live in for the past year or so. It's just really weird how they didn't see this contradiction here, and it just makes the track even more annoying than it would be otherwise. And admittedly, it would already be super annoying just as it is, even before the pandemic and all of that. But in the context of this record specifically, and the world that we're living in, it's just even more eye-roll worthy. Another one of the lower points lyrically on this project is the track "Here Comes the Rain," a song where the band seems to be wanting to cheer someone up, be kind of positive and uplifting. And on the surface, nothing about it is really all that bad per se. I mean, I don't think it's particularly interesting or anything like that. I still think it's pretty bad lyrically, just taken for what it is. But it's not offensively terrible or anything. But rather, some particular context around this particular track makes it a bit more unenjoyable to listen to, I guess. Apparently, the song is written about a friend of Rivers, a person by the name of Sam Harris, who is described as a button-pushing author and podcast host, and apparently part of the reason why this is the case is because this particular individual is a little bit racist, has some somewhat unsavory views in that field of things, and if that's the case, this track is really gross. Why would you want to make a song trying to comfort somebody with terrible worldviews like these? I mean, I don't know this person particularly. I'm not all that familiar with what they do. I can only go off of other claims about this person here. But if that's the case, then this track is kind of difficult to stomach, just because, yeah, why would you want to make a track like this uplifting someone with awful, hateful views and stuff like that? It's just very uncomfortable, and it just seems like a really poor moment on this project, all things considered, especially when you consider that most of the other tracks on this thing with their lyrics, they're bad, but they're not this kind of bad. Yeah, it's a pretty bad moment here on this project. Again, the lyrics taken for what they are, they're already kind of weak to begin with, but yeah, with this new context, they just become even worse. When you take into account everything I've already said about this record so far, this is just not a project that I really found myself enjoying all that much. I mean, sure, the first few listens here of this thing were, like I said before, a little bit refreshing as far as being a Weezer fan goes, just because the sound of this thing was different from stuff they'd done before. But once you realize that this is a sound that isn't super new, more generally speaking, and is a sound that's been done better in other places before, this album kind of loses its luster really quickly because, like I said before, yeah, this sounds pretty okay if you're just not really paying all that much attention to it, but none of the instrumentals here are really all that memorable. The performances aren't anything all that special either. The singing is okay, but nothing great either. The hooks aren't all that catchy, and the lyrics, for the most part, on this thing are really bad. So yeah, OK Human was not a record that I found myself enjoying. Personally, I could see you enjoying it more if you just happen to really like this particular sound the band chose to explore here on this thing, and I'm guessing that's why some people are really enjoying this while others aren't. But for me personally, this was just another miss in the band's catalog. Yeah, I mean, I guess if this particular sound interests you, check it out, but otherwise I'd probably avoid this one. Moving on though, let's talk about the second record that I wanted to review here today, the newest record from Anarchy 99, Rockstar Superheat. Anarchy 99 is the collaborative music project between Debbie McCallion and So Drove. Personally, I was not familiar with any of So Drove's previous releases, but I am familiar with Debbie McCallion's work, which is why I checked this thing out. This is the debut full-length release from this music project, and this is a record that is really interesting and really good too. One that is unlike anything else I've heard in recent memory. I guess the best way to describe this record, really generally speaking, would be industrial rock, but even that doesn't feel like it's specific enough to really get across what this record accomplishes in its relatively short runtime, because yeah, it's industrial and there's rock present here on this thing. Those are the two general components that make up this record, I would say, but at the same time, these more specific sounds that this thing explores are a lot more diverse than just those two labels happen to encompass. On the rock side of things here, you have some moments that feel really inspired by hard rock, some bluesy moments even at a few points on this thing, some parts here that feel inspired by punk music, whether it be more mainstream pop punk or maybe more hardcore punk at times on this thing as well, some moments that maybe feel a bit more inspired by metal music. There's quite a range of different sounds that make up the rock side of the instrumentation here on this thing. And when it comes to the industrial side of things here, you get lots of harsh noise, manipulated electronic effects going on here in this thing, whether it be with the instrumentals or some of the vocals here in this thing too. And what you end up getting here on this record with this unique mixture of sounds is a project that sounds unlike anything else that I've really heard. Because sure, there's quite a lot of industrial rock out there, but I feel like the approach that Anarchy 99 takes here on this project is really different from what a lot of other bands tend to do with their approach to this kind of music. I feel like there's more experimentation here on this thing that feels a bit looser with how it's used here on this project, more in the sense that like individual tracks here will go for different ideas as opposed to this thing trying to be like a super cohesive, tight project. But the thing is, despite all of the experimentation on these different tracks, the end result here still does feel really, cohesive and focused at the same time. Because regardless of what individual sound you might be getting on any of the tracks here on this thing, there are some consistent parts to this project that keep this thing cohesive. I love the really memorable riffs that pack the entirety of this project. I love how crunchy and harsh they sound across this project. It's something that's present on really all the songs here, and I really appreciate that. The vocal performances across this thing from Debbie are fantastic as well. Some of her most expressive vocal performances to date, whether it be really unhinged, wild vocal deliveries, some more restrained moments mixed in there as well, some really shouty, punk-inspired delivery, some growlier, deeper moments mixed into this thing too. There's a lot going on in the vocals here on this thing, but it always fits the instrumentals in a way that's really nice. And even when like some of the manipulated parts of the vocals get worked into this thing too, it still feels very natural in the context of this record, given a lot of the electronic elements that are worked into the instrumentals of this thing. The lyrics here on this project are also really great too. Like a lot of Debbie's best lyrics, I feel like this project does a really excellent job at capturing a nice mixture between some more playful, fun ideas as well as some very serious topics discussed too, and essentially combines these in a very unique and colorful, character-filled way. I mean, some of the lyrics here on this project are just absolutely super creative, interesting, and fun. Like there's a track here on this thing where she's literally singing about wanting to be on the Digimon the movie soundtrack. Like who else is writing lyrics like that on their material? Like that line alone there made me know that this was a project that I was definitely going to love. And I mean, when everything else here on the record is as good as it is, I mean, yeah, I do love this thing a whole ton. This whole record wraps up rather quickly too, at around 9 tracks and a little under a half an hour in length. It's not a super long record by any means, but it feels like a pretty appropriate runtime for this whole thing, honestly. Every track here on this thing has its own distinct personality. The flow here on this record is really nice too. It's just, the perfect runtime, I feel, for all of the ideas that are packed into this project. And at the end of the day, this newest record here from Anarchy 99 is one that I'm definitely going to be coming back to over and over again throughout the rest of this year, just because I have a good feeling this is going to end up being one of my favorites of the year overall when it comes to like best records. Because yeah, the sound of this thing is super unique. The performances here on this thing are excellent. The lyrics here are really well written and creative too. The hooks here on this project are super catchy. It's just a release that I can find myself returning to repeatedly, because every time it's just a relatively short, fun, interesting collection of tracks, unlike anything else that I could find elsewhere. So yeah, if you haven't checked out this record already, I highly recommend you do so, because as I think I've already made plenty clear in this review, this is a fantastic release and one that should not be missed. But with that said, that sums up all of the things I had to say about these couple of records I wanted to talk about here today. But before I go, one thing I do want to mention quickly is that you may have noticed that the setup I'm in currently here is different than my normal setup. That's just because I have started my final semester at university, and because of that I have a dorm that I'm living in different from before. And yeah, basically I bring this up is because if you guys happen to have any complaints with this current setup as it is in this video, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. I'm sure if this current setup isn't all that great for whatever reason you may have, I might be able to fix it, change it. Maybe there's a different angle I could work in this room that I'm in somehow, but I'm not going to do any of that unless you guys happen to have any complaints or critiques about it. And yeah, that's why I'm bringing this up. If you have any of those, leave them in the comment section down below. Or if you don't have any critiques about that, make sure you leave your thoughts on either of the two projects I talked about here today in the comment section down below. Or maybe your thoughts on both of these projects if you happen to have heard both of them. Aside from that, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like more album views, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching this video, and stay golden.